In this podcast, two Gen Xers are taking a trip down memory lane, revisiting and reflecting on the cinema of the 1980s. We'll look at the hits and the flops, the studio blockbusters and art house indies, the critically acclaimed, and the universally reviled. The series is hosted by me, Lisa Molinelli, a writer and librarian, and features Dustin Morrow, a filmmaker, author, and professor of film. So pull on your leg warmers, crank up your boombox, and hop in the DeLorean. It's time for The Long Rewind.
I am joined by Dustin Morrow. And Dustin, I'm going to let you introduce you and your show, because we're doing a bit of a crossover.
Yeah, it's a crossover episode. Our show is called The Long Rewind. It's a deep dive into the cinema of the 1980s, which is one of my areas of scholarly focus. I'm a professor in Portland, Oregon. I teach film production and film studies and film history. I'm also a filmmaker and an author, and Gen-Xer, most importantly, who is obsessed with 80s culture and 80s film. And so my wife, Lisa, and I do this podcast where every Wednesday morning we talk for about an hour about some minutia of 1980s cinema. Unlike most 80s movie podcasts, we don't go sort of movie by movie. We look at more broadly at like a specific motif or theme or a genre or just some strange thread of trends that happened in 1980s cinema, some of the more peculiar kind of nooks and crannies of 80s filmmaking. So we were insistent from the beginning on doing a show that we thought was maybe sort of 20% more scholarly than some 80s podcasts out there. And that was kind of sort of our plan, just to separate us from what is a pretty big subgenre of podcasting. So that's The Long Rewind. You can find us just by searching The Long Rewind. Our thumbnail is a little VHS videotape with the name of our show on the side of it. So Milo, for our listeners, for people who are finding this episode in our feed, why don't you tell us a little bit about the show that you and Jamie do?
Yeah, so how you get a bit of scholarly information from your show. Ours lacks scholarly information and is hosted by a couple fools, Jamie and myself, Milo. We do the 80s and 90s uncensored. More nostalgia than your mom's faux wood paneled basement, as our little motto goes. We deal with anything from the 80s and 90s is up for grabs. We do get scholarly sometimes, so sometimes we'll get serious and do sillier subjects like Chernobyl or that kind of stuff. And then we balance that with ridiculous things like which Teenage Mutant Ninja would date which Golden Girl. We do some fun movie stuff. We just did one on the Goonies that you might enjoy. And a lot of movie, because there were so many great movies from the 80s and 90s that are out there. So we try to keep our shows pretty short. That way they're perfect for your drive into work Monday morning, which is when every episode is released. Gives you something to enjoy on a Monday because Mondays usually suck, except for when our show's on.
Yeah, I've listened to your show. I think it's totally fun. I think you guys are a lot of fun. And I think that anybody that enjoys our show would enjoy your show and vice versa. So if wherever you're hearing this, you should look up the other show and give it a listen.
Ditto.
So we were going to talk about 80s versus 90s today, right?
In movies, yes.
How the cinema changed. Was there any specific area you wanted to discuss first, or because I thought a little bit about this. This is not something we've done on our show yet, but certainly as a Gen Xer, I was in my 20s throughout the 90s, so it was my period of youth, and so I have a lot of thoughts about this for sure.
I'm with you. I am also a fellow Gen Xer, obviously, and the 90s to me were kind of like my peak movie going era. You mentioned doing film and stuff when we were talking before. I do a bit of film as well. I do a bit of acting. And so that's when I was studying acting. And so I was a theater nerd and a movie nerd and stuff like, you know, Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, Kevin Smith, those films were being released in the 90s. And as an actor and filmmaker, you're like, holy crap, it is possible to get into this industry as an independent filmmaker. And to make a movie for $7,000, you don't need to be part of the mainstream cinema group or whatever you want to call it. And so to me, that's my 90s movies introduction that I think is a big change from the 80s, to where if you wanted to do independent film, it was often just B movies, right? Like Roger Corman type stuff, the low cost films that I love as well, which we can get into. Like, there's so much we can talk about here. But I guess for me, that was the big one when I think about the 90s. What about you?
Yeah, the explosion of youth-driven indie cinema, for sure. And there was an indie cinema in the 80s. It was like Spike Lee and Jim Jarmusch were doing stuff. Stranger Than Paradise came out in the mid-80s. That was a kind of landmark indie film. But Sundance really rose at the very end of the 80s, and Soderbergh's Sex, Lies, and Videotape was the big film that put that film festival on the map. And then that festival kind of became the center of what I would call like Hollywood indie filmmaking, which is to say in indie movies that have like a big budget. Like, yeah, like if you're making a movie for $6 million, like Pulp Fiction, and it stars, John Travolta, is it an indie movie? I mean, maybe technically in the sense that it's not being bankrolled by a major studio, but it's I don't know that as a low budget filmmaker myself, I wouldn't call that an indie movie.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's an interesting shift towards sort of more darker and introspective and self-aware movies, and that's all hallmarks of the Gen X attitude, right? That our big obsession, our big worry at that time was with selling out, right? Like that was the center of Reality Bites and so many other movies. We were always worried about being perceived as sellouts, and I think that was a reaction to the fact that the 1980s were so commercial. The cinema of the 80s was so commercial. It was so nationalist. It was so reflective of kind of Reagan era values. And as Gen Xers moving into our 20s, we were looking to rebel against something, and it was that. And it manifests itself in movies like Fight Club and American Beauty, and which was technically made by a boomer, but it was reflective of the attitudes of the time. And to the degree that like culture is driven by youth and seeks to be reflective, or at least to cash in on what youth thinks is cool. That's what we thought was cool at the time, right? It was like thumbing our nose at corporate America.
Yeah, I mean, it's also in the music, right? That's when we switched from hair bands to grunge and that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And so, of course, we're going to do the same thing with our movies, to go from these like big, bright films to these kind of more serious tone, darker stuff, and being like, oh man, screw that kind of stuff. We're not doing that.
Yeah.
Films, you often had tie-ins and stuff like that, whereas your tie-in usually in the 90s was a musical soundtrack. There's so many great soundtracks that came out with movies in the 90s. But a lot more, I think, story-driven type stuff as well. Dialogue and kind of a bit more down-to-earth in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it was a rejection of like the blockbuster ethos, right? To go lo-fi, low budget, dialogue heavy. Like Linkletter's Slacker was a huge movie for our generation. And like you mentioned, Clerks, Kevin Smith's movies. These were just so wildly different from what was considered to be kind of film at the center of the cultural discussion in the 1980s. Movies like Top Gun and Ghostbusters and Beverly Hills Cop. I mean, it's just worlds away from those movies.
Yeah, and you still had that kind of stuff in the 90s. I just don't think it was it wasn't as much the stuff that we wanted to see. I think, you know, so you'd still go see a big budget action flick with Bruce Willis or one of those guys, right? The Die Hard movies or any of that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But the movies that you appreciated more, I think, were a lot of these types of movies.
Yeah. I mean, as a film school kid in the early 90s, or mid 90s, I guess, that wasn't the kind of movies that I was aspiring to make. Even though I love those films, and those are the films that I grew up on. Nobody wanted to be Spielberg at that time. We wanted to be, you know, Linklater or Tarantino or what have you. But you know, every decade responds to the one that came before it and wants to separate itself from the one that came before it. And I'm seeing that even today. Although I should say that my students, when I ask them who their favorite filmmakers are and what their aspirations as filmmakers are, they're still mentioning like people from our generation. They're mentioning like Wes Anderson and Tarantino, and I'm getting a little bit of like Ari Aster and some of these sort of nouveau elevated horror filmmakers, A24 type filmmakers. But by and large, they're still interested in like movies that I would say came more out of our generation. Like Wes Anderson is the name I hear more than any other. That like he seems to be the hero to the new generation of filmmakers that I'm getting in my classes, which I find peculiar.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Not that he's not great.
Yeah, I love Wes Anderson, but he's very, I mean, it's a Wes Anderson film. And so if you're looking up to him as inspiration, it's going to be a bit hard to separate yourself from people saying,
yeah,
hey,
what do you do?
Because you're just
so
copying Wes Anderson, you know?
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about the teen sex comedy because the 80s, of course, you had the 16 Candles, Pretty in Pink. We were talking about Molly Ringwald before we started recording, and John Hughes films. You still had that in the 90s, and I think that's kind of an interesting one because I don't think it changed a whole lot. So maybe so let's say you had Porky's or Revenge of the Nerds in the 80s, right? And then in the 90s, you had American Pie and that kind of stuff. So you still had kind of the gross out teen comedy, but then you had your 80s John Hughes movies. But then in the 90s, you had like She's All That and that kind of stuff where like the pretty girl gets a makeover. You know, actually, she's already pretty, but you take her glasses off and suddenly she's beautiful and everybody knows this kind of thing. And I don't think that particular genre changed a whole lot. What do you think on that subject?
Yes and no, only because I would separate like Hughes from those. Like She's All That is, to me, does not take teenagers seriously in the same way that John Hughes's movies did. I just don't see the empathy for teenagers in that movie. That movie feels, and a lot of those movies, Can't Hardly Wait and Empire Records.
Yeah.
And those movies feel cynical to me in a way that the John Hughes movies felt really sincere. But I totally agree with you about the sex comedies. Like that, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, they didn't seem to change a lot. If anything, they maybe got even more, what's the word, crass. I don't know. I mean, nobody has sex with an apple pie in Porky's. Not that
putting your penis through a hole in the wall.
Porky's was some, yeah, exactly. Not that Porky, that's true. Yeah, they were putting the penis in a different place, I suppose, in Porky's. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It is strange that I don't think of it as, and maybe it's because I wasn't a kid in the 90s, but I don't think of it as a 90s thing. It just, like you say, teen sex comedy in my head immediately goes to like Revenge of the Nerds.
Yeah.
Or, you know, some of those movies you mentioned. But I suppose that's just because that's when my brain was forming, right? As a very little kid, you know, and those were the movies I saw. And I don't know. It's an interesting experience too, to like, I don't know if this is ever, if you've ever had an experience like this, but when you're younger than a teenager, those movies seem really adult and dirty, and I don't know, sophisticated is not the word, but they feel like it just feels different than when you're like an adult and you're watching a teen sex comedy where you're like, I don't know. Have you ever had this experience of watching one of these movies that you saw in your youth and then finding yourself being like, the parents had a point here? Whereas when you were a kid, you were like, oh, the parents are evil, man, and they're the villains. And now you're kind of like, maybe these kids should like grow up and stop acting like jerks.
Stop being a bunch of dumbasses, stupid kids.
Yeah.
It's funny enough. One thing I do now that's different is like when you're a kid, especially even before teen or what, and you see like a topless scene or something like that, and you're like, ooh, you get all excited,
Yeah.
And now as an adult, I'm like, I don't see the reason for this scene in this film. Like they're just trying to show boobs. And this poor girl has to like take her top off. So like,
and I feel like a pervert because the character, even though the actress is 29, the character's like 16.
Exactly.
Right? So, yeah.
That's very different experience as an adult. Yeah. So that's definitely one with those kind of movies.
Let me ask you about this. So what about the changes in technology between those decades, right? And the movement from like sort of analog effects or practical effects in the 80s to kind of the birth of CGI, because that seemed to me to be a real clear marker, and it almost happened right on the switch between like 89, 90, right? Like 91 was Terminator 2.
Mm-hmm.
And I think 93 was Jurassic Park. I think that was 93. Right. And by the end of the 90s, we were full on into the Matrix and everything was highly digital. And we've obviously, with very few exceptions, like there are filmmakers out there that grew up on practical effects and have like demanded in their budget that they be allowed to do that. But those are pretty rare, those filmmakers. And so by and large, we are now at a stage where you watch like a Marvel movie and it is essentially an animated film. Like it's like 90%, I mean, to be reductionist, a cartoon, which is so different from, the tactile feeling of the 80s. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a good point, because if you look at, say, like early 80s, you had the Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, which are pretty much all practical effects. And then in 99, you have Episode 1, which is, to your point, pretty much an animated film. And it's terrible.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so I think in the 90s, you had that switchover because a lot of people are filmmakers as well, in studios, really, because it's a cost thing, are like, hey, we can do this in a computer for a lot less. But unfortunately, you lose a lot of quality there. And I think that's why a lot of 80s films really have held up in that era, effects era, because you can watch an 80s film with a lot of practical effects and still enjoy it. To whereas if you watch a 90s film with a lot of CGI, you're like, it's crappy CGI.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The exceptions, obviously, like the Matrix and stuff, I think holds up. But it's a good transition. Another one I was thinking of is like Labyrinth. If they were to make Labyrinth later, would all the puppets be CGI'd and that kind of stuff? And so,
well, we kind of saw that, right? They did a sequel series to The Dark Crystal. They did a sequel series to Willow.
Mm-hmm.
So these sort of these iconic fantasy films from the 80s have been updated recently. And I mean, they weirdly don't look as good when they had like a fraction of the budget and were forced to do things with puppets, 40 years ago.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting if they, from a filmmaker perspective, and you can probably add to this, there are advantages to easy access to CGI now, because you can do stuff if you don't have money that you couldn't do before. You can get some cool like cityscapes and without a helicopter, for example. You can get certain small effects. The catch is you really need to blend it well. For example, Titanic was such a huge film when that came out, and it's mostly practical effects, but he does some CGI stuff in there. When he does some of the wide shots of the ship, there's, CGI people in there, but you don't notice it because he, A, does a good job with it, and B, does it sparingly enough to where in a way to where that's not key for the scene. To whereas in the 90s, when you start doing CGI, you then are in a lot of ways making it key to the scene, if that makes sense, to where, like, Star Wars example, one of your main characters is a CGI character and it's terrible. But when you're making a film and you got a low budget, you kind of got to go with what you have. I don't know. I do think there's a bit of a lost art with a lot of practical effects as well. Or I know a lot of people still learn them and do them, but I hope it doesn't go away completely. Do your students, are they still practical effects kind of kids, or are they all like, I could just AI this? And
yeah, they're both. You get some that are like, they really want to make it with their hands, and that's admirable. But mostly because they also just don't know how to use the technology for it, or have access to the highest level technology they need to do CGI that's really convincing. But yeah, I mean, for me, one of the reasons I'll take, like, to use an example of something recently, there was an Alien movie that came out last year, and I would rather watch, like, James Cameron's 1986 Aliens any day, because I could tell that those aliens are, even though they're less aesthetically maybe threatening looking on screen to some degree, I can tell they're in the room with the actors, and therefore the scene is just so much scarier. Like, you can feel there's sort of like an ephemeral quality to CGI where you can tell that there's no there. You can see somehow, like, intuitively, that this actor is like acting opposite a tennis ball on a stick, and not like an alien that's 3 feet away from them. And it affects the way I view the movie. Like, it really, and sort of, I think something you were hinting at too, which is they just have not been able to master, like, human movement. And so whenever you have a digitally created person, which you do in a lot of action sequences, it just never looks quite right. They don't move exactly quite right. Like, it just looks strange to the brain. I'm sure there's some sort of neurological explanation for how we're able to see that, but I think we can see that.
Well, you mentioned Jurassic Park, right? Like, the first one, pretty much any scene where they're up close and personal with one of the dinosaurs, it's an actual puppet or something. Animatronic dinosaur, to whereas usually most of the only CGI dinosaurs are kind of those wide shots of dinosaurs in the distance kind of stuff. And I'm sure that's part of that reason why that film did so well, is because of that reason. You're like, oh man, I can feel the dinosaur. I feel like I'm in the room here. To whereas the new ones, you're kind of like, are they all CGI? Do they have any real dinosaurs in this? I don't know.
Yeah. Probably not. I doubt it. Yeah. One of the things that I think that sort of marks Gen X too is this sort of, like, self-reflexiveness, like self-awareness, that can be really arch, and kind of, this is where I'm going to get critical of my own generation a little bit. I would argue sometimes really insufferable. And I think that it can be fun sometimes, like in the dialogue of, like in Tarantino's dialogue, they're the guys in Reservoir Dogs, the first scene that Tarantino ever put on screen, right, was these guys sitting around a table talking about, like, a virgin and what it really means. And that's great fun. And I appreciated Scream when it came out as much as anybody else. They're talking about the rules of slasher films of the 80s. And I was like, yeah, that's right. There did seem to be rules to that, but it seemed to go too far at some level. And I got really tired of sort of meta dash whatever the genre was, like meta horror, which was because Scream was such an influential movie that that it seemed like every movie that came out, every horror movie that came out throughout the like back half of the 90s and into the 2000s had to some way also like comment on horror movies or be aware that it was a horror movie. And I found myself longing for, even though so many of the horror movies of the 80s, especially in the slasher cycle, were really terrible, I found myself kind of pining for those because at least they were sort of somewhat sincere. Like the characters in them didn't know that they were in a horror movie.
Totally. Yeah. They weren't having that conversation that says, oh, in a horror movie, we shouldn't separate because, that kind of thing. Whereas like in the Scream movies or those ones are like, oh, somebody's killing people. Like in a horror movie, we need to not stay together. Whereas in like Halloween or any of those kind of films, they're not like, oh, we can't separate because as soon as we separate, one of us is going to die. Or don't have sex because the first people that die are going to be the ones having sex.
Yeah. Don't be the black guy because the black guy never makes it to the end of the movie. Yeah. There were a ton of them, right? But I think like that was a bigger cultural thing, right? It was there in all of Kevin Smith's writing.
Oh, totally.
It was there in all of the millions of filmmakers that were trying to ape Tarantino after Tarantino. Like Tarantino gave rise to a whole genre of movies, right? Like these Tarantino-esque crime movies, and they always had all this like really self-aware dialogue, and that's something that I think, unfortunately, hasn't gone away. That's sort of one effect of the 80s or 90s, I should say, that I think we're still dealing with that I think is kind of a bummer. And that's like a place where I wish that we could go back to the 80s, because it seems like most of the, what's his name, like Judd Apatow comedies or these heightened horror movies that are coming out today or there's a lot of like banter in these movies that's so postmodern and self-aware, and sometimes I just long for like a movie that's more sincere, if that makes sense. I think it's a drag, I guess. That's sort of one complaint I would have about the 90s movies, and it's entirely from my generation, and we should own it because we created it.
It's our fault.
Sure. It's our fault. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing I did want to bring up was apocalyptic movies from the 80s. So in the 80s, the Russians were always the enemies, and you had a lot of movies that involved nuclear annihilation and that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the Berlin Wall fell and a lot of changes in Russia, and suddenly they became our friends. And so you didn't really see as many of those, nuclear war fallout films. And it's kind of like when it came to finding a new enemy, there was the Middle East with some of them. Sometimes now it's China, I think, with a lot of movies and that kind of stuff. What's your take on that of going from our war with Russia to no war with Russia to still films that gave people that fix of we're all going to die, action-y kind of stuff?
Yeah. Well, I think the thawing of the Cold War meant, obviously, like you're saying, that we didn't have a singular big superpower that could be our enemy. And so obviously that changed who our action heroes were fighting in 90s movies. But more interesting, I think, is that it kind of changed the nature of those heroes themselves. So we went from like these really nationalistic, kind of jingoistic characters like Rambo and some of the guys that Chuck Norris was playing, some of the heavily militarized heroes that Schwarzenegger was playing, to characters like the ones that Bruce Willis was playing, these like sarcastic, everyday, like average Joe guys. Like John McClane is basically the sort of put upon, schlumpy cop who just has to rise to the occasion when these terrorists take over Nakatomi Plaza. That's really different from like Rambo parachuting into Afghanistan to fight with the Taliban against the Russians. It's just, it was was a different kind of action hero. And that's not to say that we didn't still have Stallone and Schwarzenegger making movies, but if you look at the movies that those guys made in the 90s, they were by and large not as successful or as interesting, either critically or creatively or commercially, as the stuff they were doing in the 80s, you know? Like Schwarzenegger's making like Collateral Damage and The Sixth Day and these movies that like nobody remembers really. And Stallone's making like Driven, where he plays a race car driver, or like, you know, he's doing like bad comedies, Oscar and Stop Her My Mama Will Shoot. It was just a very, like, once we lost that kind of Reagan era individualistic action hero from the 80s, I think these guys were a little at sea. It just wasn't cool to be them as much as it was in the 80s.
Yeah, they did kind of flounder around a little bit with like, I'll try this, and see kind of what sticks.
Yeah. And neither one of them ever really totally recovered, in the sense that they didn't go back. They never kind of could go back to making those kinds of movies other than as sort of nostalgia driven reboots. Right? Like, we got a couple more Rambo movies in the 2000s, but they were very much like sold as these sort of nostalgia packages. Like, come see Rambo one last time, only this time he's fighting Mexican drug cartels, which is sort of like, what's happening? Why is he in Mexico? Like, you know, it was just very, and Schwarzenegger's tried to do some of those too, and they haven't really landed either, right? He has
the Terminator movies, right? He kept doing those.
Oh God, yeah. Each
Old
one was
Terminator,
like a little worse than the last one. Yeah, yeah. I remember seeing when the last Terminator movie, Dark Fate, came out in theaters. I saw some talk show appearance where Schwarzenegger and Linda Hamilton were speaking, and the host asked them what they thought of the movie, and, you know, which is a pretty standard press tour question, where you then go, oh, it's the best one yet. The crowd is going to love it. And that's basically what Schwarzenegger said, because he's an old pro and nobody was better at promoting their work than he was. And Linda Hamilton goes,
She's subtly basically saying, look, they called me, they paid me the right amount of money. And so
I think she was like, it is what it is.
Yeah.
Like, that's the most honest piece of film promotion I've ever seen. And the truth is, I saw that movie and she wasn't wrong. But yeah, there you go.
Totally agree.
I wanted to ask you, what did you think about the movie going? We've been talking about like the kinds of movies that were being made, but what about the movie going experience? Did that change for you at all between the 80s and 90s? What it was like to go to the movies?
Yeah. So obviously in the 80s, you're a little kid, so you don't get to go as often, or at least I didn't. And when you did go, it was an experience. Like, oh man, we're going to the movies. Like, I remember going to see Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which probably was too young to see at the time, but just being so excited about it. Or the Goonies. There's another one. We just talked about the Goonies, so it's fresh in my head. But these movies, and you're just like, you just can't wait to go see it, right? You're just like, oh God, movies get it. Or the drive-in. Loved going to the drive-in cinema, and it was just this experience that you got to go out for. And then into the 90s, I still loved to go to the movies, not in the same way. It was more like, I want to make sure I know I'm able to have the water cooler conversation. I want to, Tarantino, we mentioned multiple times, right? So you got to watch every Tarantino movie that it comes out and see that. Or, you'd go on a date usually as well into the 90s. And you're like, oh, what do you want? Where go for our date and take you to the movies, that kind of stuff. So it was still exciting, but just in different ways. It wasn't as much of an event for me, but I still really enjoyed going to the movies. I still enjoy going to the movies, but now I'm much more picky about the movies that I'll actually go see, because now I'm that cranky Gen Xer where I'm like, oh man, popcorn's too expensive. People sitting in front of me, kind of thing. So that's me. Yeah.
Well, certainly like behavior in what's considered kind of allowable, societally acceptable behavior in movie theaters has changed since the cell phone, right,
Yeah.
has come in. And since people got really great kind of home theater experiences in their living rooms with these large TVs and surround sound speakers and what have you, people think that because the theater feels like their home watching experience that they can behave as if they're at home.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, that leads us down a road of getting really cranky, but you know, we could talk about that endlessly. My memory of it is that I remember all through the 80s going to these sort of single screen movie theaters. And then in the 90s, there was this real shift towards multiplexes. And it was my first experience I remember of seeing like stadium seating in a movie theater. And just those are subtle things, but they really do change how you view a movie and how, like you were saying, how special it feels to go to the movie. Like going to see a movie in a shopping mall is just not the same as going to see a movie at like one of these old school movie palace movie theaters with the truly massive screens. I mean, the screens have just gotten smaller and smaller, with the exception of IMAX, which is why you pay a premium to go see an IMAX movie nowadays, right? If you want to have a real movie going experience, that's the kind of thing you would take for granted in the 80s. Now you pay a little extra for it. Otherwise, you might end up in a theater that has a screen that's not much bigger than the TV you have at home. We didn't have in the 90s, though, thankfully, we didn't have this thing where you could order like buffalo wings or a pizza or, you know, sushi or some kind of food that was going to smell up the entire room for the duration of the movie. So I was glad for that. That's another change that I haven't loved, like turning movie theaters into restaurants. That's a very strange thing to me. Like, I just don't need that cacophony of that mixture of smells coming from all directions.
That's fair. It depends. Sometimes I do kind of enjoy it, but I do agree with you. It's kind of like if I want to sit there and eat a pizza, then I might as well just order a pizza for delivery at home and watch it at home at that point, right? Because when you're going to the theater, you want to be in the dark room. You want to experience the movie. And if the person next to you is like slurping on some, like you said, chicken wings or whatever, and crunching kind of thing.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah, hearing it and smelling it. But yeah, and I don't blame the theaters. I mean, they are fighting for their lives and they have to do anything they can to bring audiences in. And if that means giving them seats that recline so far that you might as well be in an easy boy chair, or giving you like the opportunity to drink yourself into oblivion with, you know, endlessly refillable beers or pitchers. Even I went to a theater recently and some people had pitchers of beer on there. And I was like, wow, that's a lot of
beer for 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly. Like how long do they think we're going to be here? But yeah.
Or 3 hours, really. I guess movies are so long now. I think there's tons we could discuss on this subject, but we probably should wrap it up here pretty soon. Any last things you want to bring up before we do?
Only that, you know, the whole thesis of my show, I guess, is that I wish I could go back, because I really do miss I miss the movies that were being made in the 80s, and I miss the experience of seeing them. And some of that is, you know, something we're always interrogating on our show is sort of the actual lived experience versus, you know, the rose-colored glasses of nostalgia and the kind of making everything seem idealized because it happened to you when you were 6 or 7 years old, versus the reality of it. But there are things that I legitimately miss about the film going experience in the 80s, and certainly things I miss about the types of movies and the approach to those movies that filmmakers had in that decade.
Yeah, I agree. The 80s and 90s aren't necessarily in some ways as great as we often make them out to be. We've had a few episodes on that for our show, but the movie-going experience was certainly more pleasurable then. Now, the thing I look forward to is, does the place have good nachos or not when I go to see a movie? Speaking of eating during a cinema. So,
Yeah.
not quite as excited about the movie itself.
Well, as you get older, your priorities change.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's wrap it up.
Okay.
Tell my audience where they can find your show.
It's called The Long Rewind. The Long Rewind with Dustin and Lisa. And we release an episode every Wednesday morning. And yeah, come give us a listen. How about yourself?
And for us, it's the 80s and 90s Uncensored with myself and Jamie. And you can listen to us, new episodes every Monday.
Cool.
All right.
Well, thanks for doing this, Milo. I think it's always fun to meet fellow like-minded podcasters and Gen Xers. We are the smallest generation, as you know. We're often called the forgotten generation. So it's folks like you and me that have to carry the flag and make sure that people don't forget us.
Yeah.
That we did have some stamp on culture.
That's society as a whole. I think we're the coolest sounding generation. Gen X is so much better than millennial or any of those other ones. Come on, X.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, that was our thing, right? We were so, we were skeptics, we were very, watch Reality Bites. Like anybody that wants to know sort of what Gen X was, like that's a pretty good text to start with. Heathers, Singles. Give those movies a spin, and you'll get a sense of like why boomers thought we were the really insufferable ones back in the day. Luckily, we've been supplanted by millennials and Gen Zers who are far more annoying than we ever were.
At least we didn't have phones.
Well, thanks, Milo. This was really fun.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to The Long Rewind. The program is produced by Dustin Morrow and hosted by me, Lisa Molinelli. If you enjoy the show, please consider hitting the subscribe button, leave us a good review on your podcast app, and tell your friends about the program. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.